of course, right now the tourism industry is going through a very lackluster period because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is affecting global tourism. But if you analyze the Sri Lankan tourism industry in the past 20 years, honestly, what I have to say is that I personally can't be satisfied, and I don't think any professional in the tourism industry can be satisfied where the Sri Lankan industry has been heading in the past, especially in the past 10 years. And I will explain why. Because the reason is that after the end of the civil conflict in 2009, the Sri Lankan tourism industry mushroomed into almost like a cottage industry. Because if you take some of the areas where it has mushroomed into a mass scale market, what it has happened is that it is not sustainable in the medium term or the long term. In the short term, it may benefit the local economy, like the people will have money, like everybody from like the hoteliers to the trishaw drivers, they'll be making money. But if you analyze the situation carefully in the medium term and the long term, what has happened is that they have killed the product which can sustain the industry for a much longer period. And if you take Sri Lankan tourism history in the past 60 odd years, going back to 1966, when the tourism law was implemented in Sri Lanka, and that's why the industry had sustained for such a long time. And in Sri Lanka, not becoming a mass destination, like for example, say Thailand, for example. And we of course know Thailand is generating much more tourism, probably like 10 times or even 15 times more than Sri Lanka, and it's generating a lot to the local economy. But what we have to look at is what the socio-cultural impacts for that society have been as well over the past 50, 60 odd years because of tourism. And Sri Lanka has not fortunately taken that path. And that's all to do with the proper planning of Sri Lankan tourism. And unfortunately, what happened in the aftermath of the civil war's end in 2009 is that it just became almost like a cottage industry, as I said earlier. And most people who came into the industry didn't have any clue about how to go about it. And all they did was that they would invest in, say, a small scale accommodation unit, or they would buy a vehicle at an unreasonable price at a very high cost, which only benefited the money lending companies at a very exorbitant interest rate. And if you look at Sri Lankan tourism industry carefully and analyze it, I don't know whether there has been any academic study done into the effects of tourism, you will realize that rather than the professionals in the tourism sector or the individual establishments or the local economies, who have benefited most is that these money lending companies rather than anyone else.
Do you mean mushrooming the institutions in the industry is a problem?
Yeah, it's kind of like this, because if you take, say for example, like those who have become tourist drivers in the past, say 10 years especially, if you take them, only say around 5% of them have had any proper training in tourism. Whereas most have learned on the job, and their sole purpose of coming into tourism is money. Not because of the love of the industry or the love of the culture of the people, just to make money. And not, I mean, when I say money, it's not making a living. It's because they come with a dream. I would say it's a mirage rather than a dream. That they have come in thinking that they can become millionaires within a few years. But that is not the reality. And everybody who has been in the tourism industry knows it's a very sensitive and vulnerable industry, and it has to be managed very carefully. It's kind of like the proverbial goose that lays the golden egg. I mean, if you kill the goose, you don't get anything. I mean, you might get 2 or 3 eggs, but you wouldn't get it in the long term. Simple as that.
Do you want to confirm that the tourism industry needs professionalism and perfect training on the same sectors?
Well, a realistic or pragmatic think that everybody can be a professional within a short time. I mean, not in any field, and least of all in tourism. But what we have to look at is, rather than the professionalism coming in, and it can grow up gradually in the industry, because we have among the people, and even if you go to a rural area and train a person to be a steward or room boy, what we have noticed is that they have that Sri Lankan hospitality within themselves, which is in our culture, fortunately. And that goes a long way in training our professionals into the industry. And what I would say is, more than the professionalism, is that there should be proper regulatory framework. And I will explain how it has contributed to the Sri Lankan tourism industry. Because if you look at the Sri Lankan tourism industry going back to 1966, when the tourism laws were implemented, as I said earlier, that's why the industry has sustained for such a long time. And By 1983, the numbers were 243,000 per year. Unfortunately, with the civil disturbances in the country, the numbers went down drastically, down to about 80,000 the following year. But then it again was somewhere around 150,000, 200,000 until around the mid-1990s. And then it started gradually going up as well. And that's because the Sri Lankan industry was resilient. The professionals in the industry, in the hospitality industry and in the tourism industry, they knew how to sustain even within a framework where security was a huge concern. And the tour operators, they didn't stop coming to Sri Lanka, but they came in numbers. Of course, they had the security concerns, especially with the civil disturbances in the late 1980s, and then going on within the, especially the north and east, where it was almost a no-go zone. And rather sadly, those areas didn't benefit from the tourism industry, the north and the east. But if you look at it in the medium term, I would say it's a God-given thing, because now if you take the eastern coast, that's probably one of the best beach areas left in the whole world, probably, where mass tourism has not eaten into the natural environment. And that's in fact where we have to concentrate our tourism going forward in the next 10 or 15 years. And the tourism regulatory authorities in Sri Lanka unfortunately have not done enough, in my opinion, in the past 10 years especially. Because what they have done is, after it has gone into a state where, for example, I would say specifically in, say, Unawatuna or Mirissa or in Alla, where after it had exceeded the capacity, that they have tried to regulate the industry, which is not going to help at all, and which is only going to antagonize the local people, because they are used to making a living out of tourism. And if you go to these areas I mentioned, sadly what has happened is it has mushroomed into such a state that the local tourists are not welcome in these areas. But of course, right now the locals are more than welcome, because they don't get any foreign clients. But what I can say for sure is that within the next 5 years, these areas are not going to see the numbers of foreign travelers that they're getting right now. Because of course, it's not going to be attractive to them anymore because of mass tourism.
As you said, the numbers have gone up to the sky level. So do you think it is a miracle or a teamwork done in Sri Lankan tourism?
I would say it's just a haphazard occurrence. And if you look at a place like Alla, the reason why it developed rather than, say, Badulla or Demodari is not because it was like any more spectacular than these areas I mentioned, but simply because it was a very convenient transit point for the train travelers, and then who are going down from the hill country down to the south, like to Yala and then down to the southern beaches. So it was just a matter of logistics. And of course, Alla is a fantastic destination. But if you if you have traveled in Sri Lanka, you know that there are places even more beautiful than Alla.
What I meant was like the numbers. Of course, there can be repeaters. There can be people, the tourists coming into Sri Lanka 3 to 4 times. There should be something like hidden in Sri Lanka. What do you think which is hidden in the country?
Correct. And the Sri Lankan people's hospitality and their genuine friendliness, that has been the key factor. Especially if you go down to the southern beach resorts, you can see even when the times of the security threats in the country, there were largely Western European travelers who would come every winter. No matter whether it was rain or shine, bombings or peace, they would come here and spend like somewhere between 2 to 6 weeks and spend quite a bit of money. And if you have been in the industry for long enough, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, what has happened is lately that it's not because of the love of the industry or that like you are genuinely taking care of the clients, but it's more money oriented. And sadly, that is not going to help the industry in the medium term and the long term. And in the short term, of course, it will benefit, but in the medium term or the long term, it's not going to benefit, but it's going to be quite adverse effects that you get from mass tourism.
When considering the Sri Lankan tourism, it's the government and the DMCs and the other service providers. That could be the tourist guides and the tourist drivers and the site guides and the area guides. Do you think that their service in this area is vital?
Of course, everybody has a role to play here in the tourism industry. The regulatory body, they have to make the regulations and make sure that the regulations are implemented properly. Not just like, that they are in the book, but they are implemented. And that is why Sri Lanka did not go down the path of some of these mass tourism destinations where the industry was exploited back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And the private sector, like you said, the DMCs, they have done a huge job like promoting the destination and helping the industry in the worst periods of the security threats and all through these difficult years. And of course, the most key factor is that the ground level people who work in the hotels, in the tourism industry, like as you said, being say chauffeur guides or national guides or area guides, site guides, like everybody from even being a street vendor who would be genuinely hospitable to the clients. And that's the face of Sri Lanka tourism if you take the industry literally, because that's the side that the clients would meet in and out during their holiday in Sri Lanka. And I'm sure if you go down to some of these Sri Lankan like more touristic areas, that they have kept in touch with some of these visitors who have been coming to Sri Lanka for more than 20, 30 years, and they are still very good friends. I mean, some of them, they would even travel to these countries in Europe and then come back. So that's why I would say that it's very important for the industry to be aware of these medium-term and the long-term effects rather than making a quick buck.
Do you consider tour guiding in Sri Lanka is very important in the sense of giving them a proper service?
In any destination, because the person who is going to tell you about something about Sri Lanka or the destination is going to play a key part. And it comes down to a point that it has to be properly communicated as well as the correct information has to be given. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to be like a professional with, say, the best knowledge possible. I mean, I would just give you a simple example. In most of these travel books, like I would say say professional travel books, most of the people would describe Nuwara as the city of lights in Sri Lanka, because they didn't have a proper professional explaining how the name has come in. I mean, that's a bit of a legend, but I mean, I wouldn't go into that part. But Nuwara literally translated means city lights, correct. But the real history behind that is much, much more different. So like that, there are a million examples I can take about Sri Lanka.
All right. Why do you think that the professionalism in tourism industry is so important?
In any industry, being professional and professionalism plays a key part, and especially if you are looking it at in a sustainable way. And tourism being a sensitive and a vulnerable industry, it's very important that you give a proper service standard to a client. And the best example in Sri Lanka is that some of these travelers, as I mentioned earlier, who have been coming to Sri Lanka for 20, 30 years, it's because of the hospitality of the people and the professionalism of the people as well. And sadly, what's happening in Sri Lanka is that most people who come into the industry, for example, I'll just say that being a professional national tour guide lecturer for the last 20 odd years, that you might come across a client who has come to Sri Lanka say 5 or 6 times, but still he might not have had a correct experience of the country. And say, for example, if a client comes to Colombo on a cruise ship, say American client, right? And they would come here to the city hall or the town hall of Colombo 7. In fact, the new town hall, and those who know that the old town hall is in the Peta area. And a trishaw driver who would say pick him up in Fort would bring him here and say, hey sir, do you know Sri Lanka White House? Okay, and they will come and show this building, which is behind me, which is the town hall. But how many of us know that it is not just one building from Washington DC, which has been amalgamated into this structure, but it's 3. So if you go with a professional guide, you would know what to tell to an American client. And believe me, even some of the American clients, they don't know what the 3 buildings which are incorporated into the City Hall building. And that's the important factor that a professional angle can deliver to a client. And I'm just giving you one example. And how many of the foreign travelers who come to Sri Lanka know this story? So that's the advantage of being a professional tour guide. And of course, professional guides are kind of like storytellers. I'm not saying not only the professional guides, but even a person like from without any qualifications, they might be a storyteller. I mean, sometimes it could unfortunately be not a true story, but they should have the ability to convey a story in an interactive and enjoyable manner, but while being informative and correct as truly as possible to the source. So that's why it is very important for especially I would say in the hospitality industry and the tourism industry, for those of us who are in the industry to be more professional and standardized.
You indirectly say that the industry being regulated is very important.
Yeah, it is important in the medium term and the long term. In the short term, the attitude is who gives a damn, we are making a buck. But unfortunately, what's happening is that if you look at that scenario, it's not going to sustain for, say, not even for 5 or 10 years. It's just going to eat out the resources and gradually decline into a fast downward spiral. And that is almost irreversible. And that is where the regulatory body has a major role to play, that they must regulate the industry. I'm not saying only, say, in accommodation units or transportation or guide, like in every sector, there has to be a control. And Sri Lanka has all these in the book. Under tourism laws, which have been stipulated, it is there. But sadly, say only about 5% of them are being implemented.
What we have heard in 2020 was it was a bit difficult to get the clients into Sri Lanka. That is all because of the pricing. Do you think pricing matters a lot?
Pricing matters a lot because right now in the world, and especially in this part of the world, in Asia, there are a number of countries which are coming up. For example, like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, they have come into the major market. I mean, whereas, say, 10 years before, they were just like minor players. And Sri Lanka has to compete with all these factors. But what we have not fully capitalized is the diverseness within this small 65,000 square kilometer land area, which is almost unparalleled in the whole world. And even though there have been some attempts by the authorities to market it properly, I don't know how successful it has been, because what I feel is that it could have been marketed in a much better way, and of course in a much sustainable way, and without, like, I wouldn't say without, but with the minimum impact to the society and the environment. And everybody in the tourism industry would now, of course, I mean, a professional would know that the low spending, high impact clients, even though, of course, like, they would contribute to the local economy, like in the short term, are not going to be beneficial, but rather detrimental in the medium term and the long term. So it is in fact the high spending, low impact clients that we should concentrate more on. I'm not saying that the others should not come, but our main focus should be on these markets which are more exclusive, and on the niche market products as well. I mean, of course, mass tourism and all these other markets, they can go on. But the focus should be on these niche markets, which is going to be low impact to the socio-cultural environment in the country, as well as being more financially beneficial to the country as well.
What is your final, or what is your message to the industry stakeholders being professional in the industry?
Yeah, so finally what I would like to say is that if you analyze the Sri Lankan tourism industry, how it has mushroomed into, I would use the word mushroom, I'm sorry to say this, but just mushroomed. And as I was saying earlier, most of the people who came into the industry, they were just chasing a mirage. And I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm sure if you check with the central bank that you can get the numbers of how many lease arrears on vehicles are pending right now. Because we don't have a contingency plan for tourism. I mean, this has what we have been emphasizing for the authorities to impose since 2019 April, but nothing has been done yet. So that is very disappointing. And if we are going to look at tourism being an ethically sustainable industry in the medium term and the long term, of course, in the short term it will benefit, right? But in the long term or the medium term, it's highly questionable whether it's going to benefit anybody.
Who or what institution should take the responsibility of having a brighter future in Sri Lanka?
Well, of course, it's the regulatory bodies, the state authorities who have to take the responsibility and the key hand as well. And I mean, as sad as it sounds, I will just ask one question. Like, I mean, in the past 20 odd years, what are the new products that Sri Lanka as a destination has come up with? I mean, the authorities might have a research and planning division and say domestic tourism, blah, blah, blah. But can you name a single product which has been offered to a foreign traveler, which had been developed in the past 20 odd years? I mean, if you look at the Sri Lankan tourism industry, how it has been developed, I mean, nobody probably would remember that this project called Deddua project, lake project in Bentota, which cost about around 500 million, and nobody knows what has happened to that project. And if you take the Dutch Bay Kalpitia project, it has resulted in a few properties which are almost having, say, 2% occupancy, and all are in the red books of the banks. And all these other fiascos that have been planned, I mean, like, you can say from the fiasco of how the small miracle campaign was aborted at the last minute, like everything was just down the drain. And I earnestly hope that even this new campaign that the tourism authority is undertaking right now, which is being at a cost of almost 1,000 million rupees and a global campaign, it can be, say, having a proper plan rather than having an ad hoc strategy. And honestly, I don't know whether right now, with the world going through this COVID pandemic situation, whether it's the right time to go for a major campaign or drive. I mean, I think probably just a social media, like a cross-media campaign, costing, say, maybe 1/10 of the cost of that could effectively bring down, say, maybe around 60% of the travelers by the 2021 winter. But I mean, right now, I'm sorry to say this, but I mean, I don't see any feasibility of doing a major campaign right now. If you look at what has happened in the past, say, I would say, take this one example which happened in 2013, where this Indian International Film Academy or IFA Awards was held in Sri Lanka at a staggering cost of 1,400 million rupees. There was inquiry by the state authorities, but God knows what has happened to that now. I mean, who is responsible for that waste of public funds?